So, so Renee, it's not letting her open the link until 7. So, so for her, it says she's got to wait. Okay, she can see me. And so the question is, how is the sound for you? So,
No, don't end screen. You can't. Once you started,
and
perfect.
and does that, so yeah, but how does that sound for you? Not you. I can hear you. So other people are answering my question in the audience here. I'm wanting you to answer my question. Diane?
That's it. You're in a delay.
Hello? So can you hear me okay at home? So I'm going to mute the phone. So now I'm talking and there's a 20-second delay. So you can respond to me on the phone. So Diane, how does that sound for you? Okay. 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 Hold on just a second. Renee. So I'm speaking in a normal voice here at the Jonas Center on a beautiful, cool evening. And I think it's April 24th, if I got the date right. We're hoping this works fine for everybody at home. We know it's going to work fine for everybody in the audience. Let's see if. Oh, Renee. Renee.
Yes, sir.
So she said 100%. Okay from her, but she wanted to join up before.
Just turn it up a little bit. I don't want to go too high.
So I'm going to talk to you on the screen. So how does this sound for you at home, Diane? Is the audio better than it was?
Testing, 1, 2. Testing. Test. 1, 2. Testing, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2. Hello. Testing, 1, 2. Testing. Testing, 1, 2. Test, 1, 2. This is 1, 2. Testing, 1, 2, 3, 4. I can hear myself too. It's scary. Test. You want to sing?
Ladies and gentlemen, would you please take your seats? We're going to start momentarily. Welcome. Would you please take your seats? We're going to start momentarily.
Can I have that thing? Can I use that? Can you just give me that? Phil. Jeff, Phil. Phil put this all together. Jeff, good buddy.
Hi, John. Yeah, glad you guys came. Yeah, good deal.
Okay, Numas, good luck. Have fun up there. Look sharp.
Hey, thanks. All right, let's go. All right, let's do this. Who should I introduce first? That's supporting cast.
Morning.
Hey. No, just.
Then I'll take the microphone from you. No, I should go up. You can do yours because it gets the focus.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Novato Speaker Series. I'm Phil Doherty, co-chair of the committee, along with my cohort and with the one and only Sylvia Berry. And we in the committee are delighted you're here today, joining us. Tonight we have much anticipated, exciting, and great speaker tonight to present. The committee is made up of some hardworking, talented people, and I wanted to give a shout out to them who are working here tonight. Our ticket czar is Jim Spillman, the original ticket master. Mark Bosch is our stage manager. And lucky for us, Mark, in a previous career, was a lighting czar, and he's going to be running the lights. Renee Prado here is the Sultan of Sound, running the soundboard. And we have a tandem here at the video monitor is Ethan and Peter, who are creating a live feed. Of course, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Gary Brayman, the creator of the Novato Speaker Series. Still very supportive and a big influence in the program. And I also wanted to shout out to Kevin Jacobs, Novato Council member. Kevin, are you here? Give us a wave. Before I bring up David Ruprecht, another awesome committee member, to introduce our speaker, I wanted to let you know that the speaker series is sponsored by 4 Rotary clubs here in Novato. And if you're not familiar with Rotary, we are a global service organization with 1.2 million members around the world, providing humanitarian service, promoting goodwill and peace through our humanitarian projects. And whether it's a beautification project in your neighborhood or the eradication of polio around the world, we're creating change and taking action. If you have just an inkling of interest in learning more about Rotary, you're probably sitting next to a Rotarian. And they're going to be more than happy and delighted to tell you more about their experience. So without further ado, let's silence our phones. If the need should arise, the bathrooms are right down that hallway. And David, would you come up and introduce Eric? Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Bill. Thank you. How is everybody? Good, good. Everybody's alive. That's a good. Turn off your cell phones or turn them to silent if you would. We don't mind if they vibrate. We just don't want them ringing. We're really lucky tonight because our speaker is Eric Schmitt. Now, even though Eric was born in chilly Minneapolis, he was raised right here in the Bay Area. Right here, our neighbor, Kentfield. He graduated from Redwood High School. Got any Redwood High School? And that's where he first got the newspaper bug. He was the editor of the Redwood High School newspaper, aptly named the Redwood Bark. He coached Little League in Kentfield, Green Bay, and he's continued in the sports life. He's an avid cyclist and runner and kayaker. Now, he received his bachelor's degree from Williams College, and he started his career Little Kennewick, Washington, but he very quickly moved up to the granddaddy of all newspapers, the New York Times. And he can keep a job. He's been there at the Times over 40 years. And during that time, they've had him all over the world. He's covered stories in, let me see here, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Haiti, Africa, South Asia, and Europe. Now, if you add on top of that his personal love for travel, Eric has visited over 90 countries. And he's not done yet, are you, Eric? No, no. He co-authored the book Counter-Strike, The Untold Story of America's Secret Campaign Against Al-Qaeda, and he is shared in 4, count them, 4 Pulitzer Prizes. I've never even met anybody who had 1. Eric is married to Felice Berkowitz. They have 2 grown daughters. They're out of the house, and he and Felice live in Fairfax, Virginia, which is right outside Washington, D.C. Now, even though Eric has long ago moved away from the Bay Area, and he's traveled extensively all over the world, he has stayed true to his roots. He remains, to this day, an avid and diehard fan of the San Francisco Giants. Let's welcome Eric Schmitt. Come on up here, Eric.
Well, Dave, thank you for that terrific introduction. I got to bring you along on some of my other talks. And I want to thank the Rotaries of Novato for having me and having such a great crowd out here tonight to hear a little bit about what's going on in foreign policy and national security. It's great to be back in Marin. I have to say, though, it's even better to be away from the chaos and confusion of Washington, at least for a few days. But I am going to just keep my cell phone here right next to me as we talk through this evening, just in case the White House wants to send me some classified war plans on my Signal app. Yeah. Last article we wrote, the president wasn't too happy with us, so I'm not betting on it, but you never know. You never know. Gotta be real. Well, we are just shy of 100 days into President Trump's second administration. And to say a new world order is emerging may be an understatement. Let me tick off just kind of 5 main examples. First, once a real estate mogul, always a real estate mogul. President Trump wants to acquire Greenland, make Canada the 51st state, and wrest control of the Panama Canal from the Panamanians. And so far, there are no takers. Second, in the Middle East, the president has threatened to evict 2 million Palestinians from the Gaza Strip and build luxury beachfront condos on the Mediterranean. Not only does he like the idea of controlling land, but he abhors the idea of ceding control of international waters to outlaws. The president has launched an open-ended bombing campaign against Iran-backed Houthi militants in Yemen who have disrupted international shipping in the Red Sea for the past 18 months. Third, he is shattering norms just about every day, if you check the headlines. He fired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General C.Q. Brown, as well as Timothy Hawk, who is one of the nation's top experts in cyber operations at a time when the Chinese have intensified their hacking into the United States government. General Brown was deemed too woke. General Hawk was deemed insufficiently loyal. President Trump has brought in Elon Musk and his Doge team to run roughshod over much of the government. One of his first targets was shuttering the U.S. Agency for International Development, the government's main global relief organization, a move that could mean starvation for millions of people around the world. Fourth is the global economy. The president has hiked tariffs by at least 10% across the board, the highest in a century, and is now engaged in an escalating trade war with China that could decouple $640 billion in two-way trade in goods and services between the world's two largest economies. He's ushering in a fundamental shift on the global financial order that he says will bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. and make the country's economy even wealthier. But many economists are skeptical and say the chances of a recession are actually increasing. And fifth, and perhaps the most jarring of all in the world that I cover every day for the New York Times, President Trump has upended decades-long alliances. The president now sees Europe as an adversary, NATO as a burden, and Russia as a friend to cut deals with. The president blames Ukraine for starting the war with Russia, a complete falsehood. And the United States is now seeking to normalize Russia relations with Moscow rather than contain it and punish it for invading Ukraine. I'll come back and discuss all of these kind of 5 buckets, if you will. But what I want to get to right now is kind of what's the upshot of all this? For starters, the withdrawal of billions of dollars in U.S. global aid has rapidly diminished U.S. influence in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and South America, gutting long-standing programs, severing sensitive relationships, and leaving a void that rival powers like China and Russia are racing to fill. And it's left millions of the most vulnerable in dire straits. For instance, in the immediate aftermath of the devastating earthquake in Myanmar, the U.S. didn't show up. When the first 3 USAID workers finally did arrive 3 days later to assess the damage, they got a surprising message from home: "You're fired." The casual cruelty of these firings, not to mention eliminating decades of specialized expertise, is absolutely stunning. And it's damaged what diplomats call America's soft power. That is, the power to influence without bombs or bullets. The new Premier of Canada said in late March that the old relationship we had with the United States, the tightest of military and economic partnerships, is now over. That's Canada. NATO nations are meeting regularly to discuss whether it's possible to design a peacekeeping or observer force to go into Ukraine in the event that a ceasefire takes hold. But they're doing so without the United States. They're also discussing whether Britain and France's nuclear umbrella could extend over other NATO allies, because the US may no longer be relied upon. Even Poland's president is musing aloud about possibly getting nuclear weapons for his country. It's a global erosion of trust in the United States that just 3 months ago seemed almost unthinkable. Such discussions are prompting a long overdue recognition by European nations that they will have to spend significantly more on defense, though it would probably take a decade or more to replicate the capabilities the United States brings to the alliance. The downside is that should there be a world crisis in coming years, and there's almost certainly will be, an increasingly isolated US may have to enter it without its greatest force multiplier, its allies. Now, to be fair, no one expected President Trump to handle global affairs like his predecessors. We got a taste of that in the first Trump administration. But few expected him and his team to move so rapidly and so ferociously to reorient US foreign policy away from the course it has charted since 1945. What we're seeing now is a return to a bygone era of raw great power calculations in which the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. There's no real policy philosophy to this. It's all very transactional and even imperial or imperialistic. We'll get Greenland, yeah, 100%, the president told NBC News recently, not ruling out economic force to accomplish his goal. Now, amid all these examples of international upset, there's often at least a kernel of something that makes sense. With Greenland, there's genuine concern in the hallways of Congress and the corridors of the Pentagon, where I work, about the growing ambitions of China and Russia in the Arctic. But why not then just work out something with Denmark, a longtime NATO ally? Why all the bluster and bombast that even Greenlanders who are seeking more autonomy say they dislike? So how are foreign leaders reacting to this hubbub? Well, one approach is to try and stay in President Trump's good graces, play to his vanity, flatter him. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer calls the president every few days on his cell phone just to check in. When Starmer visited Washington in February, he presented the president, a huge Anglophile, with an unprecedented invitation from King Charles for a second state visit. A few world leaders are more confrontational because it plays well at home. The new Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, has erased his party's double-digit polling deficit against a conservative rival in Canada's elections next week. He's made it all about Canada standing up for its sovereignty. So why is Trump 2.0 so different in these first 100 days than the first Trump administration? I'd argue there were three main reasons. The first is that President Trump entered office in 2017 with no real plan. Now, why was that? Because he really hadn't expected to win. He and his team stumbled out of the gates. This time, however, he and his aides had 4 years to game things out. They came prepared. They got some help from a document called Project 2025, a political initiative overseen by the Conservative Heritage Foundation to reshape the federal government. Plus, an emboldened President Trump knew how to pull the levers of power much more effectively this time. There was very little wasted time when he took office. Second, the president believes he has a sweeping popular mandate to make big changes. In 2016, he won the electoral vote, but not the popular vote. This time around, though, he won both, including the 7 battleground states. No dispute about that. But he actually won the popular vote in 2024 by only about 1.5%. So it's not the landslide he claims. Third, in the last go-round, President Trump had some veteran foreign and national security policy experts guiding him and steering him back on course when it looked like he might go off the rails. People like Jim Mattis at Defense, H.R. McMaster and John Kelly at the White House, Rex Tillerson at State. There were similar officials on his economic team, as well as his daughter Ivanka Trump, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. This time around, there seem to be few, if any, guardrails. There's basically very little or no one to curb his most extreme impulses. Nor are there congressional Republicans, like there was with John McCain in the first administration, to check his most disruptive legislative proposals. Congressional Republicans have largely ceded two of their most important prerogatives, the power of the purse and the power to confirm nominees. Only the courts so far have proved to be any kind of check on the president, as he has cowed other institutions that might hold him accountable, law firms and universities, although powerful institutions like Harvard are starting to fight back. He's also attacking the media with lawsuits and trying to restrict access. He's still in an ongoing fight with the Associated Press over its refusal to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. The president's overarching view is that he is making America great again. Peace through strength is the mantra. His critics, however, say that he is marching the country into a constitutional crisis or even a Trumpian autocracy. My conservative New York Times columnist colleague, David Brooks, summed up the fear of many when he wrote recently that the president is all about the, quote, amassing of power and destruction of anything that would restrain power. So let me go back and unpack some of those 5 major foreign and national security policy buckets that I talked about at the beginning. And we can discuss this later in the Q&A, but I kind of want to sketch out a little bit for each. The first is the president's appetite for territorial expansion. He's demanded control over the Panama Canal, which the U.S. did build in 1914, but turned over by treaty in 1999. He wants Denmark to sell Greenland to the U.S. for its rare earth minerals and strategic location in the Arctic. But Danish and Greenland officials have repeatedly said, Greenland is not for sale. This hasn't stopped the president. The White House's National Security Council has met several times in recent weeks to put his words into action and recently sent specific instructions to multiple arms of the government. The plan mobilizes several cabinet departments behind President Trump's years of talk about wanting Greenland, whose economic and strategic value has grown as warming temperatures melt Arctic ice. In many ways, this approach reflects a 19th century view of great powers, who divided the world into spheres of influence and control. It would seem the president would have a world where the Chinese would dominate the Pacific, Russia would dominate Europe, and the US the Americas. The Middle East would be up for grabs. It's less of a brave new world than a reversion to a dangerous old one. My New York Times colleague Tom Friedman wrote recently that the president's foreign policy philosophy isn't so much containment or engagement, it's smash and grab. The second bucket is the Middle East, where the president said he would end the war in Gaza very quickly. But his peace plan for Gaza would force 2 million Palestinians into permanent exile. When asked how he could seize Gaza for redevelopment as what he called the Riviera of the Middle East, when it was sovereign territory, the president shot back under US authority. Even before the president took office, his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, and a Biden counterpart had brokered a ceasefire in Gaza. But that has since broken down, and Israel has resumed its ground war there. Meantime, the administration launched a bombing campaign against those Houthi rebels in Yemen on March 15th. The goal was to reopen the Red Sea to international shipping. But President Trump also issued a threat to Iran, which supplies weapons and intelligence to the Houthis. The president said in a letter to Iran's Ayatollah Khamenei that he had 2 months to negotiate an end to Iran's nuclear program and its ballistic missiles and other advanced arms. Talks are to resume this weekend. However, Pentagon officials have acknowledged that there's only been very limited success in destroying the Houthis' vast underground arsenal of missiles, drones, and other launchers. Houthi fighters, known for their resiliency, have reinforced many of their bunkers and other targeted sites. In fact, in just the first 3 weeks of the campaign, the Pentagon used about $200 million worth of munitions. The total cost could be well over $1 billion in the coming weeks, and the Pentagon might soon need to request supplemental funds from Congress. So many precision weapons are being used, especially advanced long-range ones, that some Pentagon contingency planners I talk to are growing concerned about Navy stocks and implications for any situation in which the U.S. would have to ward off an attempted invasion of Taiwan by China. And it's here on Yemen that I want to pause and linger for a moment on the so-called Signalgate controversy, and a central question about this administration, its competency, and how the media is covering it. And just for the record, I haven't gotten any calls from the White House, so we'll have to just put that one aside for the moment. Most of you are probably familiar about what happened initially to trigger this. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth disclosed attack plans in an encrypted group chat, 2 hours before U.S. fighter jets launched airstrikes against the Houthi militants in Yemen last month. The editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, was mistakenly added to that text chat on the commercial signaling app Signal by Michael Waltz, President Trump's national security advisor. Secretary Hegseth put the operational sequencing or flight schedule for the Navy F-18 fighter jets targeting the Houthi militia on the unsecure chat. But then Secretary Hegseth complicated matters. Last Sunday, my New York Times colleagues and I reported that the Secretary had shared the same sensitive details about those strikes in a separate thread that included his wife, his brother, and his personal lawyer. Now, don't get me wrong, Jeff Goldberg got a great scoop. I'm very jealous of that scoop. Again, I'm sitting here by the phone just waiting it might be replicated somehow, but not a lot. But it did fall into his lap. That's not the way things usually work with journalists. They get those kind of things. In our follow-up scoop, it was a little bit more traditional, good shoe leather reporting. We had to dig it out. My colleagues and I figured, kind of like all of us here, we figured if Secretary Hegseth had participated in one Signal chat at work, there were likely others. After the first revelation, there was a lot of discussion about turmoil and disarray at the Pentagon, top aides being accused of who leaked what to whom, and petty rivalries and all sorts of things. That's the conditions that journalists love, you know. Let's dig in and trying to find out some of those people who would talk to us about what's going on. So last Saturday, we work all the time, 24/7, my colleague Greg Jaffe found 2 sources who basically confirmed that there was this second chat. Usually, the secretary used it for kind of administrative stuff and scheduling, but in this instance, he was kind of bragging a little bit to his family about what was going on. I got a third source. Maggie Haberman, our extraordinary White House correspondent, got a fourth. And after that, there was a lot of scrutiny from editors and from our lawyers as we pulled together a draft. This is a very competitive story. We weren't sure others were onto it, so we're really trying to hustle this out, but applying New York Times standards to this. Were the sources credible? We had to, acknowledge that these might be some of the disgruntled employees who'd been fired. But had they actually seen or been a part of this chat themselves? Did they have firsthand knowledge of the personal chat, which had about 12 people on it? Once we settled all these questions, editors had gone through and clarified things, we published on Sunday. In both of these cases, current and former defense and military officials told us it was an extraordinary breach of American national security. Not only was a journalist inadvertently included in the first group, but the conversation also took place outside the secure government channels that would normally be used for classified and highly sensitive war planning. I mean, this is what they devise these things for these senior officials to discuss using that technology. Had that information fallen into the wrong hands, and we know for a fact that the Chinese and the Russians are trying to hack in to the telephones, the devices of our senior leaders, the safety of American pilots could have been jeopardized. Because again, there was about 2 hours, and we know the Russians, for instance, feed intelligence to the Houthis. Now, this is a defense secretary who is a combat veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, who has promised to restore competency, accountability, and transparency to the Pentagon. President Trump again defended the secretary this week, with both men claiming that the information on the chats wasn't classified, that the mission was successfully completed, and that no American pilots were harmed, and that the latest revelations were the result of disgruntled former employees. But interestingly, Republican support for Secretary Hegseth is beginning to crack a bit. A Pentagon Inspector General's inquiry is underway, and probably underscoring more than anything else as we talk to pilots and other people in the military, if anyone else had done this, Hegseth's critics claim, they would have been fired if not court-martialed. The third bucket is, again, the norm shattering that goes on. And we've seen this throughout agencies across the government, but again, the ones I focus on are the military. And President Trump and Secretary Hegseth have fired about 10 senior generals and admirals since taking office, including General C.Q. Brown, the former Joint Chiefs Chairman, who I mentioned, as well as the Chief of Naval Operations and the Coast Guard Commandant, both of whom were women. This has had a chilling effect throughout the Pentagon. The President also brought in Elon Musk to oversee some of the most disruptive aspects of the administration's efforts to shrink the government. Why is this happening in the way it is? The main reason, I think, is obviously the President himself and his push to get things done in what he's in this second term of his. But what analysts also say is there are at least 3 distinct factions and a range of ideologies inside the top ranks of his cabinet and senior advisors that are also propelling this and creating tensions. There is what the analysts call the revenge team, led by officials like Attorney General Pam Bondi, FBI Director Kash Patel, and the Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard. They have instructions to rip apart the Justice Department, the FBI, the intelligence agencies, hunting down the so-called deep state and anyone who participated in the prosecutions of President Trump or is otherwise sufficiently loyal. That's group 1. Then there's the Calm the Markets team, led by Scott Bessent, the Wall Street billionaire who the President chose for Treasury Secretary. Right now, he's got the toughest job in Washington, I think. Bessent can recite the MAGA lines about deregulation and lower taxes, but would likely try to make sure the President's most extreme solutions, like the inflation-inducing tariffs, that they don't tip the country into recession. And we've seen Secretary Bessent talk this week a little bit about that to try and calm the markets. Then there's the government shrinkage team, led by Musk, whose goals are wildly ambitious, to put it mildly. He wants to carve out what will be at least what he called $2 trillion from the annual federal budget, a figure that exceeds the annual cost of salaries for every federal employee. The reach of Musk and his DOGE team defies any type of real accountability, and his successes so far have been exaggerated according to an analysis by some of my New York Times colleagues. In fact, this week we saw Musk, because of the downturn of Tesla's stock, took a steep decline, said he's now going to probably cut back his time in Washington to maybe 1 or 2 days a week, which has many cabinet officials breathing a sigh of relief, I'll tell you. I want to pause here again to recount a story of how Elon Musk nearly came to be briefed on the Pentagon's war plan in China, and what it says both about the current state of affairs in Washington and again a little bit about how my colleagues and we do our jobs. One Thursday afternoon in March, we got a tip that Secretary Hegseth had invited Musk to the Pentagon the next day for a top-secret briefing on the U.S. war plan for China. This meeting was supposedly going to happen in the tank which is this special secure room that the Joint Chiefs use for meetings in the Pentagon. Very unusual for a civilian to go into one of these meetings. At first, my colleagues and I were very suspicious. We didn't believe this could be possible. After all, Musk was not a military advisor, and he had massive conflicts of interest because of his business ties in China. But I confirmed the tip with one source. Maggie Haberman was able to confirm it with another, and we were off and running. There was pressure on this story because, again, this meeting was scheduled to happen the next morning. So if we wanted to have some impact on this story and let people know what was going on, we had to get this story out that evening. So 5 of us scrambled to pull together nearly a 2,000-word story in just a few hours. This included background on Musk's business interests and his relationship with the president, which has survived much longer, I think, than many people had thought, including many of us journalists. By early evening, we had posted the scoop on the New York Times website. Well, the biggest problem for those who were involved in this, Secretary Hegseth and Musk and others, was that no one had told the president about this meeting, and he was not happy about it at all, because even he recognized the conflicts of interest that this represented. And by midnight, he had stormed around the White House and had basically ordered this super secret briefing that Elon was going to get to be canceled. Now, to be sure, Elon showed up the next morning to get a briefing at the Pentagon. He went up to Secretary Hegseth's office, and we shouted questions at him, and they kind of dismissed us. But he got a sanitized version of what he was originally going to get. Again, a little bit of window of how the workings of Washington, particularly this administration, what's going on. The fourth bucket is clearly the story of the moment. That is the tariffs that have dominated headlines for the past several weeks. The president's decision to slap tariffs on worldwide trading partners, including such allies as Canada, Mexico, and the European Union. Behind these tariff walls, President Trump says he plans to preside over a manufacturing renaissance in the U.S. as companies that moved offshore to low-wage venues return home. In fact, the White House has cited the example of General Motors saying they've pledged to increase production of light trucks at a particular factory they have in Indiana. So that's one thing they hold out there. But finding workers to make many of these products could be very difficult. Low-wage, physically taxing labor, like textile operations, are unlikely to attract much interest from U.S. workers. Elsewhere, the transformation could take much longer and produce a disappointing number of jobs. Just as globalization benefited some workers and hurt others, typically manufacturing workers with the fewest skills and least education, the president plans will also create winners and losers. Now, the plummeting stock market, and more importantly, the sinking bond markets a couple weeks ago, forced a partial rollback by the president, a 90-day pause in many of the tariffs. But then right away, Trump, the president, increased tariffs by 125% on China. But then he pulled temporarily back on smartphones, computers, and other electronics. But then he and the Commerce Secretary said he would impose new tariffs on all these goods in the future. So what is it going to be? You can tell the whipsawing back and forth is striking. And hanging over this is the uncertainty about what the president will do next. Companies hate uncertainty. As many of the small business owners among you all know, it's so hard to plan with that kind of chaotic uncertainty swirling around, without that lack of stability of knowing what you can do, where your customers will be, how much you can invest. The ultra-conservative and free trade Wall Street Journal editorial page said this 2 weeks ago. The reality is that Mr. Trump is making this up as he goes, and it would help if he had an actual strategy to deal with China in particular. Again, that's the Wall Street Journal editorial page. Finally, again, the bucket that I am most familiar with, and the one that I've been covering over the last few years, and that is the alliances, foreign policy here. President Trump views alliances not as a positive, but as a drain on American resources and power. he is convinced allies, in particular, are looking to sponge off American might and not pull their own weight. How do these alliances benefit the U.S., the president asks repeatedly. The U.S. turnaround on relations with Russia and Ukraine is the biggest change of all. And how did this unfold? Well, you really have to go back in terms. Obviously, the president talked about this in the campaign, but go back to February, shortly after the inauguration, when the president had the U.S. vote against a UN General Assembly resolution condemning Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Among the countries the U.S. joined in siding with the Russian position, North Korea, Belarus, Sudan. This positioned the U.S. with the globe's chief rogue states in opposition to countries that have been America's best friends since World War II or before. At the same time, President Trump's stunning embrace of Russia and its President Vladimir Putin has allowed Moscow to come in out of the cold diplomatic isolation chamber that Washington and the West sought to build after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, to try and have Putin reverse what he did, or at least settle for some kind of settlement that was beneficial for both sides, possibly. The president talks about doing business with Russia and removing a raft of sanctions imposed on Moscow dating back to that original invasion of Ukraine in 2014. As the president has embraced Russia, he and his top lieutenants have often given Ukraine a cold shoulder or worse. In February, Secretary Hegseth took a couple of important bargaining chips off the table in meetings in Brussels by refusing to offer Ukraine long-term security guarantees and saying that Ukraine had no chance for NATO membership anytime soon. Now, these were all things that diplomats were talking about, but saying quietly. Why do you, the argument went, why do you say these things out in advance of any kind of negotiations? Why do you cough these things up before the talks even start? Then there was the Trump and Zelensky's disastrous meeting in the Oval Office. Now, to just go back for a little context, Ukraine has always been a more complicated case. Only 26 months ago, Zelensky was feted in Washington as a warrior for democracy, invited to join and address a joint session of Congress, and applauded by Democrats and Republicans. But President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance had signaled for months that in their minds, the American commitment to Ukraine's independence was over. At that fateful Oval Office meeting, Zelensky had been warned about these dynamics, but did not read the room as well as he could have. The other thing he did was he spoke English during this, not obviously his first language. He'd have been better off, diplomats later told me, if he'd been able to go through an interpreter. The leaders of France and Britain preceded him to the Oval with plans to placate the president and explain how Europe was stepping up its defense spending. But Zelensky eventually became combative. He reminded President Trump that the oceans between America and Russia won't protect it forever. The president raised his voice and told Ukrainian he would be lucky to get a ceasefire, suggesting that any terms would be better than defeat. Zelensky retorted, "I want to see guarantees." Moments later, he stormed out of the White House, leaving a luncheon of rosemary roasted chicken and creme brulee uneaten, a rare earth minerals deal unsigned, and his country's future ability to defend itself in serious doubt. The Russians couldn't believe their good luck. Former President Dmitry Medvedev thanked Trump for telling the truth to Zelensky's face and urged him to suspend remaining American military aid. And indeed, President Trump temporarily cut off U.S. military assistance and intelligence sharing to Ukraine. Zelensky eventually relented and the aid resumed a few days later. But the president repeated Kremlin talking points that Zelensky was a dictator because he had not held an election since the war started. Funny thing, neither did Winston Churchill in World War II. Since then, the U.S. has been trying to broker a deal between the two countries, but Putin seems to be getting the best of the American negotiators in these talks, analysts say. The president's strategy for ending the war often seems to be one of carrots and sticks, but it's largely carrots for Russia and sticks for Ukraine. The United States initially claimed to have brokered a partial ceasefire in late March between Russia and Ukraine that included a moratorium on attacks on energy infrastructure and in the Black Sea. However, there have since been numerous violations of this partial moratorium, and Ukraine and Russia have yet to agree officially on the terms. Putin, meanwhile, signaled he is hesitant to agree to a full ceasefire. President Trump recently changed his tune a bit in his tone, telling NBC News that he was very angry with Putin after weeks of attempting to negotiate a ceasefire. The president also threatened to impose a 50% tariff on countries buying Russian oil if Putin did not agree to a ceasefire. As this is going on, senior military officers have been warning about Moscow's true intent and its future goals. General Christopher Cavoli, the top American general and one of the most expert generals the U.S. has in Russian affairs, a fluent Russian speaker, told the Senate in April that Russia, quote, will be a growing threat, one that is willing to use military force to achieve its geopolitical goals and is today actively waging a campaign of destabilization across Europe and beyond. There are more recent signs of strain. Last Friday, Secretary of State Marco Rubio's comments left the impression that the U.S. would soon move on from trying to end the war if progress wasn't made. Asked soon after whether he was being played by Russia, President Trump told reporters, "Nobody's playing me. I'm trying to help." And just today, a night after one of the worst bombings of Kyiv by Russians in over a year, President Trump said on his Truth Social media, "Vladimir, stop." This week, however, Vice President Vance insisted that Ukraine accepted a deal that many analysts feel is one-sided, one that would basically award Russia the territory that it seized so far, about 20% of Ukrainian territory. It would guarantee that Ukraine would not enter NATO, and it offered very vague security guarantees for Kyiv and for President Zelensky. President Zelensky has rejected these, and that has led the administration, again, to threaten to pull out of any talks and perhaps let the conflict to continue. What is essential for the U.S. is to continue providing military and intelligence support to Ukraine, as such support is the only way to convince Putin that further stalling is not in his interest, analysts say. Aid is also essential to ensure that Ukraine maintains its ability to deter Russian aggression, even if there were to be a ceasefire agreement. Cutting off aid will just worsen fighting, many analysts I've spoken to say, because it will embolden Russia and force Ukraine to fight on with European help only. Of course, it is easier to blow up an existing world order than to create a new one. For all its faults, the post-World War II system avoided great power war and encouraged economic interdependence. The president believes that the post-World War II system, created by Washington, ate away at American power. That system prized relationship with allies committed to democratic capitalism, even when those alliances came with a cost to American consumers. It sought to avoid power grabs by making the observance of international law and a respect for international boundaries a goal unto itself. To President Trump, however, that system gave smaller and less powerful countries leverage over the United States, leaving Americans to pick up the tab for defending allies and promoting their prosperity. So where do we go from here? Well, the impact of the dismantling of USAID has become evident already. In just the past several weeks, the Trump administration has slashed many of the programs it had pledged to preserve. The cuts threaten to leave some of the world's poorest countries, countries like Afghanistan and Yemen, without adequate supplies of food, clean water, and medicine. Tom Friedman wrote earlier this month that the president and vice president, quote, want to take us to a post-America that is not the least bit interested in preserving, let alone enhancing its soft power, the power to enlist allies and attract talented immigrants. They have contempt for soft power, being utterly ignorant of the fact that if we lose it, we lose our ability to get other nations to join us to shape a world more receptive to our interests and values, the single greatest advantage we have always had over Russia and China. American allies are going to need to seek strength in numbers, and we're already seeing that organization happen. The Europeans need a plan to take on a greater role at NATO and to cooperate more closely with Asian allies such as Japan and South Korea. And given how the president has dealt with Ukraine, the fear is growing in Taiwan, according to the analysts I speak to there, that it could be next as part of some grand bargain with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Meantime, here in the United States, the country is turning inward, and we see a growing partisan divide. A Wall Street Journal poll earlier this month found that 81% of Republicans agreed that U.S. allies haven't shouldered enough responsibility for their own defense, and the U.S. should stop using tax dollars to defend them. In contrast, 83% of Democrats agreed with an alternative statement that international alliances are a source of strength and should be supported by taxpayer dollars. These differences reflect a years-long trend of Republicans taking on a more isolationist view of America's role in the world. In closing, I want to leave you with this thought from another one of my New York Times colleagues, often writes in the conservative bent, Brent Stevens. Brett writes, "The United States is a vast and diverse country and an old and resilient democracy that won't quickly fold into authoritarianism and illiberalism the way Russia or Hungary did. The habits of freedom, 250 years old, still run deep in our bones, deeper than anything this president can ruin over the next few years. But that certain idea of America that once typified us and for which we were once so admired is evaporating." Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and a discussion.
Thank you much. Thanks very much, Eric. It was terrific. It's Q&A time, and we have a couple of microphones that we're going to rove around with, and if you would raise your hand, wait to talk so that we can bring your mic, a mic to you. We also have an opportunity. Being in community like this, we have an opportunity to listen with courtesy to questions and perhaps different perspectives, and so I hope we'll all be respectful of each other. Okay.
How much of the current situation in Ukraine was established 30 years ago with the fall of the Soviet Union and the guarantee to the Ukrainians that if they gave up their nukes, they would have security guarantees? And what was happening with the Trump organization at that time and their relations with Putin that might have led to today's developments?
Well, is this working? Yeah, now it's working. There are critiques, of course, that the seeds of this were planted 30 years ago. This is Vladimir Putin's narrative right now, that Ukraine was never a nation, that despite, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, when Ukraine became an independent country and was recognized by the rest of the world, in his mind, he never really embraced that. And that's always been a part of his philosophy here, is that he is basically, when he first went into Crimea in 2014 and took parts of eastern Ukraine, that this was reclaiming what was legitimately Russia. I think these arguments and the arguments that the U.S. at the time, there was no written, there were some discussions, but there was no treaty that basically would say to the Ukrainians, if you give up your nuclear weapons, which they did, we will provide ironclad security guarantees. It was an understanding more than a written treaty. And I think that's what we come back to here. And certainly, I think that you had, up until 2014, you had the world respecting those norms. What we saw then, of course, Russia had already taken bites out of Georgia and other places around the former Soviet empire as Putin became more aggressive and was trying to take territory back. So this is part of the Putin narrative, and to some extent, it's the narrative of other conservative Republicans who are saying, look, we're asking for this, and this is what's happening, and we should just go along with this because this is what the Russians wanted anyway. That is not the way international law works. It's not the way the norms of nations work these days. The trouble is, you've got a situation now where the Russians do control almost 20% of the territory. And right now, they're fighting, grinding it out. There are about 5,000 casualties almost every single day, on both sides going in this. And Russia is a country that's about 3 times the size of Ukraine. So in a war of attrition, they're most likely going to prevail because Putin doesn't care. I mean, we've seen the carnage that he's willing to accept and the cost of revamping his entire economy into a war economy. Ukraine has been remarkably innovative, particularly with its use of drones and being able to counter some of the military superiority in numbers that the Russians have. But it's even with the help that they're getting from Europeans, and it's a lesser share. The United States only provides now about 20% of Ukraine's arms, but it's some of the most important weapons. It's part of these, the Patriot missile defenses, for instance, that can knock down the most advanced missiles that are, creating havoc for cities like Kyiv and others around the country. So they can hang in there for a while, but without American support and solely on Russian support in their own domestic industry, it's going to be tough for them to prevail in the long run. That's why many people feel that if you can put more pressure on Putin, there has to be a negotiated settlement. Now, it's unlikely that Crimea would be able to go back or at least be formally recognized by Ukraine, but it may be in some kind of frozen conflict status set aside for negotiations for in the future.
Hi, Eric. How are you?
Hey, John. Good to see you.
Nice to see you, too. You did a wonderful job of laying out the 5 buckets, although I might have put Elon Musk in a bucket of his own and see if he could jump his way out. I'm wondering, to what extent do you see the administration manipulating each of these buckets as a distraction to deflect attention from any one issue that's coming up too much, and then moving along so it's keeping the press off balance, it's keeping the opposition, we used to call ourselves Democrats, but it's now the opposition, off balance. I'm wondering whether you see that happening, and to what extent can he keep doing that?
Well, I think, and thanks for the question, John, is a classmate of mine from Redwood, and I think you've seen this. We saw this in the first Trump administration, that the more you can throw out there, it's just very difficult, whether it's for the media, for the courts, for Congress, for the public, to kind of keep track of it all. And by the time anybody can focus on one thing, we've moved on to another crisis. And that's all part of the strategy. It's just been refined and expanded in this administration. And in some ways, it's been very effective. And you have, again, going back to the Project 2025, you had a blueprint that can follow, but it's being followed even more aggressively. And I think what you've seen now is I think that we're up to now something like 150 injunctions that various courts have placed on different acts, legislative means, obviously the whole issue of deporting undocumented migrants back to, whether it's down to Guantanamo Bay or into this terrorist prison in El Salvador. The courts catch up, but the problem is, by the time the courts catch up, it's kind of like the fire engine arriving as the building's been burning for a while or burned down completely. The damage has been done. So I think even if some of these decisions, let's say DOJ imposed, of gutting agencies like USAID are restored, you have to ask yourself, if you're an employee, do I really want to go back and work for that agency, or do I want to work for this federal government right now with the uncertainty still hanging over it? And so even in the long run, if the courts prevail and force the administration to restore some of these things, they may still achieve many of their objectives. And so, again, that's why I was saying kind of the speed and the ferocity with which they've done this is impressive in what they're doing. It unfortunately leads to a number of instances where, in the case of DOJ, for instance, they end up cutting some very important things. Like inspecting the inspectors who gauge whether nuclear materials are being smuggled into the country. Oops, we forgot about those guys. Let's put them back on the payroll. Or you see some of the confusion that's happening right now in the Pentagon, where you have, a guy who is by all means, one of the least qualified secretaries of defense in history. I mean, he's a guy, obviously who served honorably in the military, but he's never run a major organization of any major size, and he brought in a bunch of people who hadn't done that either. So some of the consequences of this speed and lack of experience are also showing up.
Hi, as I was driving here, I was wondering, between the time we booked you for this event and now, how many times you would have had to revise your remarks?
I was revising them like 5 minutes before. It's like I had to keep changing things. It's like, again, the comments today that the president made about Putin. This is a shifting target, and the courts are changing. I mean, I haven't been watching my phone the last hour, but I'm sure something has happened somewhere. And so that's part of the problem here. It's every single beat reporter in the New York Times Washington Bureau, and there are about 150 of us, everybody's beat is affected in one way. We're working collaboratively together in Washington. I work very closely with my colleagues overseas, whether they're reporters in Central and South America on the migrant issue, reporters in Russia and Europe on the Ukraine issue, in stories on the Middle East. And so we're trying to stay on top of this, but it's very challenging. And we've heard from readers, I mean, many of you perhaps, that it's just exhausting to try and keep up with it. And some people are saying, we need a break from all this. And I say, I get it. I mean, I go home and my head hurts sometimes. It's just going like this. But this is not the time to kind of turn aside. This is the time where you really have to kind of put your head down and engage. As journalists, that's what we're trying to do, shine a spotlight and continue. And it's interesting because in the Pentagon press corps, and we have a great press corps, and we're competitive with each other. But right now, there's also, many of us have been frozen out of our office spaces and stuff like that. And so there's a sense that, you might be sharing more information among yourselves than you might have before, just because you're not getting very much right now out of the public affairs personnel. That's not just the Pentagon, but many other federal agencies. And so it's kind of a race to see if we can get the information and get it out to you all and have you all, react to that. Again, we're not at war with the administration. We are here providing information for the public so they can help decide what policies they want, what programs they want, and ultimately who they want to be their elected representatives.
I do have a question on a more serious note. You mentioned that France and perhaps Great Britain were thinking of extending their nuclear umbrella over allies in Europe, and that Poland was talking about acquiring nuclear weapons of its own. I'm wondering what you see are the prospects of traditionally non-nuclear nations like Germany, Japan, South Korea acquiring their own nuclear weapons as a deterrent now that the U.S. deterrent has been pulled back.
Well, I think it's across the board. Every country now, particularly those countries that have relied upon the American nuclear umbrella, whether it's in Europe or in Asia for decades, are now having to rethink that because they just don't know if they can rely upon the United States. And that's something that is just jarring to hear, whether you talk to diplomats and to some extent to military officers. And these are people who, in talking to their counterparts, of course, they're trying to get answers, but oftentimes they don't know themselves because the senior political leadership in the United States is still sorting out a lot of this. We're still sorting out a policy about what to do in Syria, for instance, with the dramatic change of government there, and what do you do? We're trying to decide, how extensive the U.S. counterterrorism force will be, something that I've been covering now for over 20 years. So there are many policies that are still being debated at the highest levels of the U.S. government, but until there's a clear answer, it's left many questions open to both our allies and our adversaries.
Hi, I have actually two questions, and the first is, you didn't talk about immigration concerns because that's not part of foreign policy, but they are coming they are coming up against judicial boundaries. And so what happens when they don't follow the judicial boundaries? And my second question is, as a journalist, where do you draw the line between where you're trying to be objective and you're trying to get all the facts, but personally you're like, we can't do this. We can't rip up our alliances. We can't do this. Like, how do you separate the emotion from the reporting and the advocacy from the journalism?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll start with the first one. I didn't address immigration as much because we could have a whole talk about immigration tonight. It's a beat that I cover kind of tangentially as it deals with foreign policy, which it obviously has, and I tip my hat to my colleagues both in Washington and the field who are focusing on this very closely. You raise a question that for all journalists, it's been, it's a fundamental question of, how do you check your own views at the door here when you come to work every day? And I'm not going to tell you, my views don't ever cloud some of my copy. I mean, that's, our goal is to be as objective as possible. But there's an increasing push in journalism to be as analytical as possible, because you all get your news, on your phones, your tablets, and whatever it is. You can get that in a number of ways, and hopefully you're getting it from the New York Times as well. But more importantly is you want to know what are the consequences of this information? What are the consequences of these latest tariffs? What are the ripple effects going to be? What is the impact going to be? What's happening next? You want to know the interpretive part of this. And so there's more and more pressure on kind of beat reporters like myself. I'm not a columnist, I'm not Tom Friedman, I'm not Maureen Dowd, that's their job, is to kind of talk and have a voice, a very clear voice about what's going on. But for reporters, you're out there digging up facts and laying them out there as best you can and trying to understand the motivations that come behind those. And in Washington, everybody's got a story. Everybody's got, an angle. And I'm not just saying they're all malicious or nefarious, it's just the way it is. And you have to be able to present that and present that complexity to your readers and your viewers, and we are now presenting more and more things through audio and video, and I hope you listen to programs like The Daily and look at the little videos we have on our homepage, because I think that in many ways they convey, in sometimes just a 2 or 3 minute video, things that are they encapsulate those things very well. But it's something that we rely on our colleagues to check if they think you're pushing yourself too much, too close to the line, and we certainly rely on our editors to say, whoa, wait a minute, how is this sourced? Where are you going with this? Let's watch the tone of this language that we're putting into. Because again, I want to emphasize, the New York Times and most of the reporters that I deal with, we're not at war with any administration, Democrat or Republican, but we're trying to shed light on policies, personnel, and things that you, the public, can make your own informed decisions.
Thank you for your talk. Since the Manchurian Candidate, I've been interested in propaganda. And I want to ask if you would just give a summary of what you think is real about how Russian or Chinese propaganda plans and other incursions besides what they do overtly, what they do covertly, has influenced this administration and specifically the head of this administration?
That's a question we've been pursuing, and my colleagues, my competitors have been pursuing, for years and years, going back certainly to the first election. And despite, this administration's attempt to call, the Russian investigation a hoax or fake news, it was clear that back then, in 2016, Russia did try and influence the United States by, having social media sites that amplified tensions that were already within the American system. They didn't have to invent this themselves. It was already here within our population. They just sought to exploit that. And it's very hard to understand, what impact that may have had on the election, the first election with Hillary Clinton and President Trump. What was the thing? Because I'm sure it was a combination of events. And there's You know, I mean, that's of course what the president's critics will say of him, but there's been no evidence that ever ties him back, despite his business ties going back to Deutsche Bank, for instance, and those kind of things. We've looked at that very closely. And sure, there can be things that look suspicious, but in the end, you know, and I would commend you to people like Fiona Hill, who was one of the top Russia experts in his first administration in the NSC and is now kind of one of the most astute Russia analysts, fluent Russian speaker, was often in the meetings with the president, knows Putin. And I think she would tell you that it's more of a strongman complex than anything else. He looks at people like Putin or Xi or Modi or Orban, and he says, I want a system like that. That seems to be what the analysts who track this most, he likes that kind of power and control more than anything else. And, you know, it's, because as we look for that kind of answer, we've searched and we've interviewed people, and it's so far we haven't found anything like that. But he certainly is. He speaks about these dictators, you know, admiringly in many ways, even when he can't have the systems that they have in those countries.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, sir.
My question is slightly almost like what the gentleman mentioned, but I wanted to focus on the term fake media. And I just wanted to get an understanding from you how it has affected legacy media, mainstream media, because we feel from 10 years ago, there's just been this barrage of just coming down on the media streams that we trusted for a very long time. And I'm just wondering where things stand right now in terms of trust of the mainstream media because of all these other ones that have popped up that do not have any accountability to anyone.
Well, unfortunately, if you look at public opinion polls, trust in the mainstream media is way down. I mean, it's certainly down from when I first started my career over 40 years ago, and it's getting worse as the country, I think, has been divided very much along partisan lines. And when you have senior officials in the government, starting with the president, singling out news organizations that are trying to hold him and his aides accountable for their actions and their policies, and he just repeats it over and over and over again. And the way people get their news these days, you know, it's very siloed. And if you only listen to one or two certain types of news outlets that are very sympathetic, I'll say, to the president, then you listen to this being repeated over and over again, and you're probably going to start believing it. I know one of the most frustrating things for me as a journalist is when I started my career, of course, there were always divisions, Republicans, Independents, Democrats, but the thinking was that if you could go and gather up enough facts, whether it was in a policy, a program, a controversy, a military campaign, whatever it is, and you could present those, put them on the table, that more often than not, even your deepest skeptic would say, okay, maybe my assumptions were wrong about this. They were open to that kind of assessment. Today, there's about half the country that if I say I'm from the New York Times, they're programmed to just block me out and say, I'm not going to listen to you because I've been told you're just fake news. And whatever you created, you know, you've created out of thin cloth or whatever. And I have to be honest, I don't quite know how to get through to those people because we are more and more, we're trying to be as transparent as we can about the processes we go through, you know, in terms of the number of sources we check with, how we double, triple, quadruple check, how we rely on as many documents as we can, hard documents that are coming out of an administration. We look at incredible things that my colleagues and we have called the Visual Investigations Department that basically takes publicly available data that's out, whether it's audio data, visual data, it could be from cell phone cameras, surveillance, security cameras, overhead surveillance, publicly available things, and knit together narratives from everything from the January 6th attack on the Capitol to the President Bashar al-Assad's bombing of his own people in Syria. Very compelling, basically, you know, your own eyes look at what's happening here. But because of the advent of technology where you literally can create fake images even now, you're not quite sure what's real and what's not. You have to be, with AI now, it's really hard. And so what I tell people is you have to rely on your trusted news sources. What has carried you through up until now? Whether hopefully it's a part of that's the New York Times, but you need to read more than us. Hopefully you're reading The Economist, or you're reading some other newspaper in some other part of the world that has a legitimate, reputation. El País in Spain, certain publications in Japan, these kind of things that are known for their credibility, and rely on them and rely on their reporting. Or ask some colleagues you trust, who's the good source of this kind of information? Again, whenever I see something Fiona Hill is saying on Russia and Ukraine, if she's in a panel discussion, if she's on a podcast, I listen, because she knows her stuff on that particular subject. And so I think it's a hard type of thing, but we just kind of have to, we in this journalism world, we have to every day show up and keep doing what we're doing and chip away at some of this fake media narrative until hopefully at some point we break through. Maybe not with everybody, but enough where it swings, people can focus and say, hey, this is what's really going on here.
Earlier this month, the brakes came off the German budget. The Germans have been extremely cautious in how they spend their money, and they had some restrictions on how much money they could spend for defense. But both houses of the German government voted earlier this month to take the brakes off and spend whatever's necessary to make up the shortfall produced by the United States' attitude that they're no longer going to defend Europe. Europe is going to rearm. They've already started. They're going to do it in a big way. They're doing it with a focus on Ukraine because that's where the danger is, and they recognize that. All of Europe is going to be involved in this. Do you think that Europe, working all together and under circumstances where they've got to be ready, willing, and able to do what has to be done, you think they're going to be able to make up for the lack of support from the United States to Ukraine?
The short answer is yes, but they can't do it overnight. It's going to take several years to get that capability because, frankly, they've relied on the United States for many certain capabilities. Things like Patriot anti-missile defenses that the United States produces and exports in many ways. But you're right. I mean, what we've seen is in many countries in Europe, their defense industries are really gearing up. And part of this goes back to the first Trump administration. This is a positive thing. I mean, President Trump threatened, in some regards, to pull the United States out of NATO unless the other European allies paid more of their share. And the target goal is to get up to about 3% GDP and beyond that now. And so I think, the combination of Trump's threats and the real threat of Vladimir Putin on your doorstep, that has a sobering effect on people. That gets your attention, because if you're particularly in the Baltics or if you're in those Eastern European countries, I was in Poland in December, they get it. They're right across, they're right nearby here, and they've been invaded before. They know what it's like to be under Russian domination. So, but it's going to take time. Most of these are wealthy countries. They can get there. But the race is on to see whether they can get there by the time that if there is a ceasefire, whatever it looks like, by the time Russia will rearm. Because Putin will start rearming and trying rebuilding his military, and he'll come right back at Ukraine. Every indication is he's not going to give up, no matter what agreement is brokered at this point. And I think you also have to look at Ukraine. Coming out of this war, I mean, they are going to be a powerhouse in terms of their military capability. And of course, even though they've suffered tremendous casualties, they are going to be the most experienced warfighting nation really in the world at that point. And their innovation, and I come back to this innovation of drones, is nothing short of remarkable. What they haven't been able to do is build to scale. And that's what they're working on now with certain European partners.
I was happy to hear that the New York Times has, as you said, 150 reporters in Washington. But I wonder what your view is with regard to the fourth estate and its ability to check, for lack of a better word, the power of the three branches. Given the fact that...
Can you speak a little bit louder? I'm missing a little bit. What?
Oh, okay.
Check on what?
You want me to repeat the whole thing?
No, just the last
Okay,
little bit.
so given the fact that CBS is right now in talks with merger with Trump ally Larry Ellison, and Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, I'm kind of wondering what you think the fourth estate's ability to check the power of Washington is.
Okay, I think I got most of that. I mean, clearly, as I mentioned in my remarks, the president is going after pretty much every institution that would try and hold him accountable, whether it's the Congress in some ways. He's already basically, the Republicans are basically falling in line with him. But in terms of law firms and universities and the media, with the media, what's been interesting and kind of, disappointing is what's happened in many of the parent news organizations of outlets like NBC, ABC, CBS are basically cutting deals with the administration or appearing to because they have other interests with the government, whether it be mergers, I think is what you referred to before, and they want those to go through. And so they're looking at this, the cost-benefit analysis of what is it going to take if we go to trial, and whether we can win or lose, that's going to take a lot of time, but it may put us in a more negative position with the administration on this larger corporate goal. And I think that's what's been kind of surprising to see a number of these news organizations basically say, we have bigger fish to fry with the administration, thus we're going to sacrifice some of these journalistic entities. And that's been troubling. And I think, Jeff Bezos has come under criticism because he was, right on the ramparts there in the first administration. And he's been criticized for being less so this time around. He gave $1 million to the inaugural committee. Some of his other companies, not the Washington Post, but other companies have other, business reasons and other business factors in the administration. And so, sadly, we've seen an exodus of really top-flight reporters and editors from the Washington Post, many of whom have come to the Times, and that's great. But it's not a good thing to have a staunch competitor like the Washington Post being weakened like this. And don't get me wrong, the Post is still a formidable competitor with us, but they've really been weakened, I think, in terms of they've had both leadership challenges, both in their newsroom and in their publishing entities, and then obviously with Bezos himself. And so when you look around the media landscape, you've got the Wall Street Journal and Murdoch, and you have the New York Times, and thankfully we're in a much better financial situation than we were a decade ago when we were in debt, had to go to Carlos Slim for loans. We're doing pretty well financially, thankfully, but you can't say that for most of our industry. And that's, for the industry to be kind of in the tension and turmoil it is now, it's such an important moment when journalism is playing such an important role and kind of shining a light on what's going on in the White House and the administration overall. It's really challenging, I think, for what we do in our profession.
Okay, my question is this. I look at, you've mentioned peacekeeping forces, the European Union, which is primarily an economic entity, putting together a peacekeeping force for Ukraine. You've talked about the cessation of the United States and USAID, so we're not getting into the international developmental third country game. We're pulling out of that. Both those things, helping third world development and peacekeeping, have for 60 plus years been United Nations activities. The United Nations has been involved in that. So my question in this new world order, would you evaluate or comment on what kind of a player the United Nations is going to be, or is its day over?
Well, I mean, again, you've raised a really good point. I'd go back and say, these other organizations, it's not like even people at USAID that said, their organization couldn't use some reform, couldn't use some streamlining. But it's one thing to come in with a scalpel. It's another thing to come in with a meat cleaver and just kind of, disembowel the entire agency on such short notice. That's the other thing. This is all happening so fast. But you raised a good point about the UN. But UN and UN agencies, and there may be some of you, out there who've worked for or alongside the UN. Obviously, they're all over the world, but the UN has problems, to be sure, in terms of their own ability to manage large, organizations and aid. But, in terms of what's left, it could well boil down to, the member nations of the UN and the UN agencies themselves, as well as NGOs, assuming they can step in to do this. But in the short term, and again, emphasize short term, because we don't know where all this is going to play out, we're clearly seeing that this already, having severe effects. My colleague Declan Walsh, who's just a tremendous foreign correspondent, he's been reporting in Sudan over the last several years, and particularly this year in the starvation there. He just had a remarkable report in the New York Times, I think last weekend, talking about how they can document in some of these clinics, the aid they were getting from U.S. money just dried up almost overnight, and the doctors and nurses there can say, these children who died in the last 20 to 48 hours would have been alive under that previous aid. That you can actually start documenting cases of deaths and child mortality in this case because of that. And until the world system can catch up, and it may not be able to catch up to the levels it was before, we're going to see a lot of suffering, I'm afraid, just from the anecdotal reporting that we see overall.
Thank you for a very good presentation. I wanted to bring it back to national security. You've described a very, very dangerous world we live in right now. I'm reminded of Santayana said, those who do not learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat them. I'm thinking 1938, 39. I'm thinking of Ukraine being the new Czechoslovakia. They gave that away, didn't satisfy people. I'm thinking of China being the new Japan, and Iran, less Italy. How do you see that all playing together and fitting the parts together? Because back in the 30s, the U.S. was isolationist. We had got through World War I, and we didn't want to go back to it.
Well, obviously it took Pearl Harbor to pull the United States back into an internationalist position, because you're right, and there was, a lot of fights going on that Roosevelt had leading up to Pearl Harbor, what kind of support he would give Britain and others. In this case, what we're seeing now, again, going back to what's different from Trump 2.0, from the first Trump administration, you put your finger on it, is this axis you have between Iran, China, Russia, and to some extent North Korea. We have North Korean soldiers, 5,000 of them, fighting in an area called Kursk, which is an enclave in Russia, where the Ukrainians were able to punch through. You have the Iranians providing some key weaponry and some missiles and other things like that just didn't happen. You've got China playing a very important role in buying discounted Russian oil, as is India. And so I think what's one of the major differences here, and we have to, all those countries have obviously got weaknesses. I mean, the economy right now for Russia is not doing great. It's a wartime economy they can't sustain the levels that it's at. You have China, which right now is what U.S. national security officials see as the long-term threat. But they've got problems economically at home doing that. Iran, we've seen, because of the damage done by the Israeli attacks, not just to Iranians' air defenses, but to all the Iranian proxies in the region, Hezbollah, Syria, now in Hamas in Gaza, they have really been dealt, severe blows. But you put them all together in that kind of coalition, and they're formidable. And there's no sign, really, that they're going to be breaking up anytime soon. So I think that's one of the challenges moving ahead for this administration and probably administrations in the future, is how the United States, if it continues this trend, in more of an isolationist trend of pulling back into this America First approach, what happens is those countries gain more authority, not just in a national security sense, but you have China basically saying, look at our economic model. Follow our economic model, not the American economic model. And look at what's happened to the dollar and the value of the dollar just in the last, few weeks. That's really scary. That just hasn't happened very much. And I think those are the kind of things we have to watch long term. And again, it's the speed with which things are happening. It's next week will be the 100 days. I mean, it's just, to me, it's just, and my colleagues, we're 100 days into a 4-year term here. It's quite something.
Okay, we've got 2 more questions left here.
In your personal opinion, will the increasing demonstrations in the streets make a difference?
Well, I think they will, in the sense that, and again, all politics is local. So if you start changing local campaigns here on the ground, whether it's in whatever states, and obviously the next big elections, I mean, we have one coming up in my home state of Virginia. We've got a big gubernatorial race this year. That will be kind of a bellwether. There's some special elections coming up, but obviously the big one everybody's watching are the midterms and what happens in Congress, particularly the House of Representatives. That's the one everybody's watching. The Senate's going to be more difficult because of who's in cycle right now. So I think if people, and we're seeing more and more, the protests, they may not have been the size the initial protests were in 2017, but they seem to be growing, they seem to be widespread across the country, and they seem to be focused on a number of issues, and that gets people's attention. And it's fascinating to watch these town hall meetings that many of these senators and congresspeople, from Republican districts, and the blowback they're getting from people, to the point where they're just not having them anymore. I think that's another sign. They're worried, I think, about that. And they're worried about, they're all hitched to President Trump's star and wherever happens with him. And you watch, his poll numbers are cratering over the last, month or so. Now, he can correct that. He can pull out of it. We'll see. And it's going to be tough, I think, as we've seen. But I think it can make a difference, but it's going to have to be concerted if everybody kind of watching in that sense. And I mean, it's going to be extremely hard fought on both sides.
Okay, one last question.
In reference to Greenland, the base we have there, do you think Trump's talking about taking Greenland over is going to be detrimental to the base that we have there now?
The United States has one base. It had several bases going back to World War II. That's why the interest was there. It's right now a base in the northern part of Greenland. J.D. Vance recently visited there, but didn't go off the base, because as they looked around and wanted to check and see if anybody wanted to talk to them, they found out that nobody was interested. The Greenlanders weren't interested in talking to them. But I think what we'll end up seeing there was interesting. I saw that the King of Denmark is visiting Greenland either this week or this weekend. I mean, it's really put immense pressure on the Danes, who haven't treated the Greenlanders very well, from what I can tell. And I'm not any kind of Greenland expert, although my daughter Talia, who's in the audience, is one of the few people I know who's actually been to Greenland on a Climate One trip, so she may know a little bit more. But I think what we'll end up seeing is some kind of economic pressure on Denmark to have closer ties, because as I said, there are legitimate security interests in Greenland. I mean, there are, as with the melting ice and all, in the importance of the sea lanes up in the Arctic now. Those are legitimate issues. But again, is this the right way to go about it? That's, I think, what the question is. Nobody argues, and the Danes are just, tell us what we can do. How, we're willing to build more bases. We're bending over backwards. It's just the idea that you're going to seize this country because of this kind of manifest destiny type of attitude is just kind of foreign, I think, to most people in this century, in this time frame. I want to thank everybody it's a great turnout and great questions tonight. I've got a few books over here that I think I'm going to put up for sale. If you're interested, I can sign a few. But anyway, thanks you very much for your time and attention tonight.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much, Eric. We appreciate Eric agreeing to come and talk, and when asked, he didn't hesitate to come back to his home county. So we thank you very much, Eric. And five lucky people can get a signed book over there. Sylvia will take your $20, and Eric will sign it. Remember, we're a series, and we have the final event in our series is Keena Turner, the 49er great, who's going to talk about the Super Bowl runs of the 80s, so that'll be great. There's flyers as you head out, QR code to join our mailing list and learn more. Thanks very much for coming.